What if the absolute freedom you felt choosing your cereal this morning was, well, a complete illusion?
Oh, wow. That is quite a way to start.
I mean, think about it. Usually, when we talk about human choices, there is this underlying assumption of unrestricted autonomy. You walk into a massive supermarket, you look at the cereal aisle, you see 50 different boxes, and you just pick one.
Right. You just grab the one you want.
Yeah, your hand reaches out, and we intuitively assume that at that precise second, you could have easily chosen any of the other 49 boxes with absolutely no prior cause dictating your movement. It feels like a completely blank slate.
It feels entirely neutral.
Hmm.
We naturally gravitate toward the idea that we are the uncaused originators of our own decisions. I mean, it provides a sense of total independence from any outside influence or internal predetermination.
But then you step into the world of rigorous historical theology, and suddenly that blank slate shatters.
It really does.
We start looking at the actual mechanics of the human heart, and the landscape of our decision-making becomes something far more structured and honestly far more challenging to our modern sensibilities. Welcome to Reformed Thinking, a show dedicated to applying rigorous theology to everyday life. Today, we are taking on a massive mission for this deep dive. We are looking at Jonathan Edwards' classic theological and philosophical text, Freedom of the Will.
Yes. Our objective here is to uncover the true mechanics of human choice. How do we actually make decisions? Are we truly free in the way human intuition assumes? Grasping these concepts is absolutely essential for a robust, reformed understanding of God's sovereignty and human responsibility.
Which is such a critical balance.
It is, because if we misunderstand the architecture of the will, we will inevitably misunderstand the nature of grace.
And we want to speak directly to you, the listener, right out of the gate. We all know the basic tenets of the Westminster Confession. We know the doctrines of the fall and divine sovereignty.
Right, those are the basic.
But understanding the specific psychological architecture of your own will clears up massive confusions regarding how those doctrines actually operate in real time. It takes lofty theology and lands it right in the middle of your daily decision-making.
It really changes how you view your own temptations, your own failures, and the absolute necessity of divine intervention.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can analyze why we choose, we have to define what the will actually is, because there is a lot of philosophical fog surrounding this term.
Edwards is incredibly helpful right at the outset, because he cuts through what he calls the metaphysical refining of philosophers who had obscured the issue. He offers a refreshingly simple definition.
I love how simple he makes it.
It is brilliant. The will is simply the capacity by which the mind chooses anything. That is it. The faculty of the will is that principle of mind by which it is capable of choosing.
So there is no complicated mystery to it?
No, an act of the will is the same as an act of choosing. He also adds a crucial point. Choosing one thing automatically means refusing its opposite. The positive and the negative are set before the mind, and the mind's determination between the two is the act of the will.
Let us compare this to an everyday scenario to see how practical it is. Suppose you are standing in a room and you decide to sit in a chair.
Okay, simple enough.
Choosing to sit down means you are actively refusing to stand. Every single action is an election of one state over another. You cannot sit and stand at the same time.
Right, that is physically impossible.
So your mind evaluates the options. It develops a preference for sitting over standing, and that preference, that choice, is the will in action. There is no hidden mystical faculty operating behind the scenes, pulling levers. The willing is simply the choosing.
What is fascinating here is how Edwards defends this straightforward definition against other philosophical heavyweights of his era, specifically John Locke.
Locke is a huge figure here.
He is. And Locke argued that desire and will are distinct entities that can actually run counter to one another. He posited that a person might will something while simultaneously desiring the absolute opposite.
Locke gives a very specific example to try and prove this, and I want to push back on it because it sounds plausible at first glance.
Go ahead, lay it out.
He says, imagine a man who is obligated by someone he cannot refuse, maybe a king or a tyrant, to use persuasive words on another person. But secretly, the man wishes that his persuasive words will fail.
That is a classic dilemma.
Locke argues that in this moment, the man's will is to speak the words, but his desire is for the words to be ineffective. Therefore, according to Locke, will and desire are clashing. They are running in opposite directions.
And Edwards meticulously dissects this scenario to show why Locke is philosophically mistaken. Edwards points out that the will and the desire are not actually clashing over the same object.
This is where we have to be really precise.
Yes, we have to isolate the immediate object of the will. The immediate object willed is the physical act of speaking the words. Why does he will to speak them?
To avoid getting punished by the tyrant, obviously.
Precisely. To avoid a severe negative consequence from the tyrant forcing him. So, in that precise moment, speaking the words is what the person desires to do. The desire for the words to fail in their persuasion is a completely separate object altogether.
I see the logic, but let me challenge that from a modern perspective. Think about doing your taxes.
Well, everybody loves tax season.
Right. I will to pay my taxes, but I certainly do not desire to hand over my money. Are those two things not in conflict?
They seem to be in conflict until you define the immediate object. You do not desire to lose your money, true. But you deeply desire to stay out of federal prison.
That is a very strong desire, yes.
When you are sitting at your computer, hitting submit on your tax return, your immediate desire is to comply with the law to secure your own freedom and peace of mind. In that exact second, handing over the money becomes your greatest desire relative to the alternative of going to jail.
That makes total sense.
The will to pay and the desire to stay out of jail are perfectly aligned. You are not willing against your desires. You are simply prioritizing a stronger desire over a weaker one.
For the will and desire to truly run counter to one another, they would have to oppose each other on the identical object at the exact same time.
Which is logically impossible.
Right. The man would have to desire to speak and desire not to speak in the exact same respect, which is a logical contradiction. Edwards proves that whatever you are willing in the present moment is what you are desiring in that present moment based on the circumstances you are facing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this affirms a core Protestant truth. Humans are integrated beings. We are not fractured entities where our actions operate completely independent of our core desires.
We are a unified whole.
Yes. Our choices are not arbitrary loops made by a neutral faculty. They are the direct expression of our underlying inclinations. When we sin, we cannot say, well, my will did that, but my true desire was against it.
That is such a common excuse, too.
It is, but it is false. The action reveals the true underlying inclination of the heart in that specific moment. We act according to what we favor.
Which brings up a massive structural question. If the will is simply the mind choosing, and our choices reveal our present desires, what actually determines the direction of that choice?
That is the million-dollar question.
If I am looking at two options, what tips the scale?
Edwards lays down a definitive rule to answer this. He states that the will is always determined by the strongest motive as it stands in the mind's view.
So define motive in this context.
By motive, he means the whole of that which moves, excites, or invites the mind to volition. It could be one single factor or many variables working together as a complex motive. But the rule's absolute. We always choose what appears to be the greatest good or the most agreeable option at that precise instant of decision.
Let us use Edward's own vivid example to ground the drunkard staring at a drink.
It is a sobering illustration, no pun intended.
He has his liquor before him. He has to choose whether to drink it or pour it down the drain. The choice is not a coin flip happening in a vacuum. His mind is actively evaluating competing motives.
There is a war happening in his mind.
Exactly. On one side, he has the immediate pleasure of the drink. He anticipates the physical sensation, the dopamine hit, the temporary numbing of his anxiety.
And on the other side of the scale, you have the distant misery. He knows about the hangover awaiting him tomorrow. He knows about the potential for ruined relationships, lost employment, and long-term physical destruction.
Those are heavy weights.
They are. These are the weights resting on the scale of his mind.
And if he drinks it, it is not because his will somehow bypassed his motives. If he drinks, it is because in that specific moment, the immediate pleasure of the alcohol appears as the greatest agreeable good to his mind.
The future pain simply seems less weighty than the present relief.
Yeah, the scale tips toward the drink.
Precisely. Now, we must define what Edwards means by apparent good or something being agreeable. It does not mean something is morally righteous or objectively beneficial.
That is a crucial distinction.
It means it is pleasing to the mind in that isolated moment. Edwards breaks down the specific variables that make an option seem agreeable, and this is where his analysis becomes incredibly psychological. First is the nature of the object itself.
Like, what is the thing we are actually looking at?
Right. Is it inherently beautiful or repulsive to the person? Does it naturally promise pleasure or trouble?
The second variable is timing, and I think this is the most relatable aspect of human failure. Nearness in time makes a pleasure seem far more agreeable than a distant one.
Oh, absolutely. Proximity changes everything.
Edwards notes that if you have two equal degrees of pleasure, but one is available right now and the other is a year away, the immediate one will appear far more agreeable simply because of proximity. We see this all the time in behavioral economics.
People will always take a small amount of cash today rather than a larger amount of cash next year.
That is behavioral discounting, and Edwards identified it centuries ago. The immediate gratification of a sin right in front of us often outweighs the distant promise of heavenly reward or the distant threat of judgment.
The future consequence feels abstract, while the present temptation feels concrete.
That leads directly into his third variable, the manner of view. A vivid, immediate sensation is far more persuasive than a faint imagination.
Yes, the senses play a massive role here.
Edwards points out that looking directly at the sun is much more vivid than closing your eyes and thinking about the sun. Actually tasting a piece of fresh fruit exerts a much stronger pull on the mind than merely contemplating the abstract idea of fruit.
When a temptation engages your senses in real time, it creates a massive advantage for that motive to attract the mind and move the will.
But let me pause and ask a clarifying question. If we always choose the greatest apparent good, does that mean we are always following logical rationality?
That is a very common misunderstanding.
Because looking at the drunkard, pure logic screams, do not drink that. Reason calculates the long-term devastation and correctly determines the cost is far too high. So why do we do irrational things if our minds are calculating motives?
That is a vital distinction to make. Edwards clarifies that when he says the will follows the dictate of the understanding, he is not talking about pure sterile logic.
Okay, what does he mean by understanding then?
By understanding, he means the entire faculty of perception and apprehension. The dictate of pure reason might indeed say, do not drink. Reason accurately calculates the future misery.
But reason is not the only thing in the room.
Exactly. The corrupted mind's perception takes all things into account, including the intense physical craving, the vividness of the immediate pleasure, the exhaustion of the person's current emotional state, and altogether it finds the immediate gratification more agreeable.
Reason is just one single weight on the scale, and its resistance is frequently overpowered by the heavier weight of immediate sensual desire.
Which is a perfect illustration of the Westminster doctrine of the fall. The natural mind is darkened.
Edwards is showing us the exact psychological gear shift of how that darkness operates in real time. Our perceptive faculties are broken. Therefore, sin always appears to the unregenerate mind as the most agreeable choice in the moment of temptation.
The mind views rebellion against God as more pleasing than submission to him.
We choose sin because, in our fallen state, we genuinely prefer it. We find it to be our greatest apparent good.
Yes, the preference is deeply rooted in our fallen nature.
But wait, if my choices are just a mathematical calculation of my strongest motives, and if my fallen mind naturally perceives sin as the greatest good, aren't you essentially saying I am forced to sin? That my choices are a necessity?
I can see how it sounds like that.
I am struggling to see the difference between this framework and just being a meat robot programmed by God. If the outcome is fully fixed, how is that not just coercion wearing a philosophical mask? We need to figure out what necessity actually means before we turn God into an author of coercion.
This brings us to a critical juncture in Edwards' argument. We have to correct our vocabulary. Edwards spends a significant amount of time redefining words like necessity and impossibility because using them intuitively, rather than philosophically, creates massive theological errors.
Vocabulary is everything in theology.
It really is. We have to contrast the common use of these words with their rigorous philosophical use. Edwards calls the common use the vulgar use.
Okay, define the vulgar use of necessity.
In the vulgar sense, something is necessary if it happens despite our active opposition. If a man physically throws you off a bridge, your falling is necessary in the vulgar sense.
Because I certainly do not want to fall.
Right, you cannot stop gravity. Your will is violently opposing the fall, but your will is insufficient to stop it. Vulgar necessity implies an insufficient will fighting against a larger, overpowering external force.
So applying the vulgar definition to our own choices is completely absurd.
It is entirely absurd.
If someone says, it is necessary that I choose virtue, and they mean that in the vulgar sense, they are saying, I am forced to choose virtue even when my will is opposing it and I am trying my hardest to choose vice.
Which is a complete contradiction.
You cannot voluntarily oppose your own present voluntary choice. You cannot choose something against your will because the choosing is the willing.
Spot on. Therefore, when we talk about the will, we must discard the vulgar definition entirely. We must use the philosophical definition of necessity.
And what does that entail?
Philosophical necessity has absolutely nothing to do with opposing forces or fighting against your will. Philosophical necessity simply means a full and fixed connection between a subject and a predicate. It means a certainty of outcome.
Just a guarantee of what will happen.
Yes, there is no opposition involved whatsoever. If the subject and predicate are perfectly connected, the outcome is certain, and therefore it is philosophically necessary.
Let us expand on that, because certainty of outcome is a heavy concept. How do events become philosophically certain?
Edwards outlines how things can be universally certain, which he calls general necessity. Mathematical truths are universally certain. 2 plus 2 is 4. It is necessary in its own nature.
That makes sense. It cannot be anything else.
But there is also particular certainty. This is when an event is certain for a particular person at a particular time, based on their specific circumstances. Consider a past event. The fact that you woke up this morning is now necessary.
Because it is already done.
Exactly. It has already happened. The connection is fixed in history. Nothing you will today can alter the fact that you woke up earlier.
So applying this to human decision-making, when Edwards says our choices follow the strongest motive by moral necessity, he is not saying we are dragged kicking and screaming against our desires.
Not at all.
He is saying there's a full, fixed, and certain connection between the strongest motive in our mind and the choice we make. The outcome is certain, but the mechanism of that certainty is our own active preference.
This raises a crucial question regarding Reformed theology and objections to it. People frequently argue that if God foreordains whatsoever comes to pass, then humans are just puppets, and divine decrees force us to act against our will.
That is the most common objection you hear?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Edwards shows that God's decrees establish a philosophical certainty, meaning the events are absolutely certain to happen, but they do not impose a vulgar necessity.
God is not pushing us off a bridge.
Right. God does not force humans to act against their own desires. Instead, human beings act precisely according to their own strongest desires, and yet the outcome is perfectly certain and exhaustively known by God.
The certainty of the choice does not destroy the voluntariness of the choice.
That is the key takeaway right there.
That is a radical paradigm shift. Certainty does not equal coercion. Knowing infallibly what someone will choose based on their distinct inclinations does not mean you force them to choose it against their will.
It really reframes the whole debate.
If I know my dog will choose a piece of bacon over a piece of broccoli with 100% certainty, my knowledge of that certainty does not mean I am coercing the dog. The dog is acting entirely upon its own motives.
That analogy holds up perfectly. And establishing that necessity does not mean coercion sets the stage for what I consider Edwards' most illuminating distinction: the difference between natural inability and moral inability.
This gets right to the anatomical heart of the human condition. Let us define what we mean when we say someone is unable to do something, because we use that word very loosely.
We throw it around all the time.
I might say I am unable to lift a car, and I might also say I am unable to tolerate a specific genre of music. Those are two very different types of inability.
Edwards divides inability into two distinct categories to clear this up. First is natural inability. Natural inability means you cannot do a thing even if you passionately will to do it. The physical or external barriers prevent you.
Right. If I say, I want to fly by flapping my arms, but I am unable, that is a natural inability. I have the sincere desire. My will is actively choosing to fly.
But you lack the physical wings.
The defect is in my nature, my body, or my physical environment. My will is not the problem. My physical capacity is the problem.
Now contrast that with moral inability. Moral inability means you are unable to do a thing because of a fixed lack of inclination or the overwhelming strength of a contrary inclination.
So the body is capable, but the heart is opposed.
Exactly. The physical capacity is fully present. There are no external barriers blocking you. The only thing missing is the disposition of the heart. You cannot do it because you resolutely refuse to want to do it.
I love the modern analogy of a dedicated vegan. A dedicated, lifelong vegan is naturally able to eat a steak. They have teeth, a functioning digestive tract, and the physical capacity to chew and swallow meat.
Nothing physically stops them.
But they are morally unable to eat it. Their ethical commitments and desires are so strongly opposed to eating meat that they are completely incapable of generating the will to consume it.
That is a great contemporary framing. Edwards provides his own striking examples to solidify this. He asks us to imagine a child who possesses a profound, genuine love and duty toward his father.
Okay, a loving child.
That child is morally unable to assassinate his father. Think about the physical reality. The child has the physical muscles to pick up a weapon. He has the natural ability. There is no physical force field stopping his hand.
But his righteous character, his deep love, makes it utterly impossible for him to generate the will to commit murder. The barrier is entirely moral.
And Edwards gives an example on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum. Imagine a person who is totally malicious, consumed by hatred. That person is morally unable to do a genuine, heartfelt act of kindness for their enemy.
Another moral barrier.
Yes. Again, they have the physical hands to hand over a gift. They have the vocal cords to speak a kind word. The natural ability is completely intact. But their overwhelming hatred creates a moral inability. They cannot choose kindness because their heart utterly despises the idea.
What is fascinating here is the implication this has for moral responsibility. Edwards makes a rigorous analytical point. Moral inability is never a valid excuse for sin.
Never.
If you fail to do something because of a natural inability, you are entirely excused. If someone asks you to lift a massive boulder to save a trapped person, and you try your absolute hardest but lack the physical strength, you are not blamed for the failure.
Your will was right, but your natural capacity fell short.
But if you fail to do something because of a moral inability, you are entirely blameworthy. If a malicious person says, "I cannot show kindness to my neighbor because my hatred for them is just too strong," we do not excuse them.
We condemn them precisely because their hatred is so strong.
The inability itself is the sin. The deeper the moral inability, the more corrupt the person is. To say, "I am so wicked that I am unable to choose good," is the ultimate confession of guilt, not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
This brings us to the mechanics of total depravity. When Reformed theology teaches that fallen man is unable to come to Christ, it is specifically talking about a moral inability, not a natural one.
That is a massive distinction to make.
Unregenerate humanity is not naturally unable to believe the gospel. They have physical ears to hear the sermon. They have brains to process the logic of the cross. They have the natural faculties required for belief.
But they are morally unable. Their fallen inclination utterly rejects God. The natural mind considers the things of the Spirit to be foolishness. They cannot come to Christ because they vehemently refuse to come.
Their strongest motive is always self-rule and rebellion against their Creator.
So, when a sinner rejects the gospel, the fault lies entirely, 100%, in their own corrupt will. They are choosing precisely what they prefer, and what they prefer is to remain in rebellion.
This completely dismantles the argument that God is unjust for demanding faith from those who cannot believe. God's demand is perfectly just because the only thing preventing their obedience is their own stubborn, voluntary refusal.
There is a capacity of nature sufficient, but a disposition is wanting. Nothing is missing but a willing heart.
Well said.
Okay, let me push back on behalf of our listeners. If we are morally unable to choose good without grace, and our choices are mathematically dictated by our strongest motives, are we truly free?
That is the big pushback.
We need to define what liberty actually is, because people will say, if my disposition guarantees my choice, I am not free. I am just playing out a script.
To answer this, Edwards goes back to the basic, biblical, and common definition of liberty. What does freedom actually mean in the ordinary use of human language? Liberty is simply the opportunity to do as one pleases, without external constraint or restraint.
Break down constraint and restraint for us.
Constraint means being forced to do something you do not want to do. Restraint means being physically blocked from doing what you do want to do.
If you are free from constraint and free from restraint, you possess true liberty. If you desire to walk outside and the door is unlocked and no one is physically holding you back, you are completely free to walk outside.
That is it. If you can do what you desire, you are free.
The common definition of liberty does not ask how you came to have that desire in the first place. It only asks if you are able to execute the desire you currently possess.
But Edwards notes that theological opponents, specifically Arminians and Pelagians, require a much more elaborate, convoluted definition of freedom. They argue that true liberty requires a self-determining capacity.
They believe the will must have sovereignty over itself, operating entirely independent of prior motives or inclinations.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They argue for a state of perfect indifference, or equilibrium.
Equilibrium, that sounds so clinical.
The idea is that for a choice to be genuinely free, the mind must be perfectly balanced between two options, completely uninfluenced by any prior bias, habit, or motive. You must be in a state of absolute neutrality, and from that neutrality, the will simply decides.
Edwards dismantles this concept of equilibrium using pure, unassailable logic. Think about what a choice actually is by definition. It is a preference.
Right, you are preferring one over the other.
How can a mind that is in perfect equilibrium, meaning it has absolutely no preference for either option, generate a preference? It is a logical absurdity. If the mind is genuinely indifferent, it is not moving toward either option.
For a choice to happen, the equilibrium must be broken by a motive.
And let us say, for the sake of argument, that a choice were to somehow occur without any motive whatsoever, without any reason, desire, or inducement tipping the scale. What would you
Oh,
even call that?
would not be a moral action, it would be random chance.
If a decision has absolutely no cause, no thought, no desire driving it, it is the equivalent of mental static. It is a dice roll in the brain. We do not praise people for random spasms of the mind. We praise them for choices guided by a desire for goodness.
This leads to Edward's most devastating and beautiful argument in the entire text, which settles the debate permanently, the moral agency of God. This is the ultimate, undeniable proof that true freedom does not require equilibrium or the ability to choose evil.
Yes, God is the supreme moral agent of the universe. He possesses infinite understanding, infinite righteousness, and infinite capacity. Yet, the scriptures are explicitly clear: God cannot sin.
It is impossible for God to lie.
He is morally unable to choose evil. His holy nature dictates that he will always, with absolute, unbending certainty, choose righteousness. His strongest motive is always his own glory and perfect holiness.
This raises a crucial question that Edwards poses to his opponents. If true liberty requires the ability to choose between good and evil from a state of neutral equilibrium, does God lack freedom?
That is a staggering thought.
Because God is certainly not neutral and he certainly cannot choose evil. If the Arminian definition of freedom is correct, then God is the least free being in the entire universe.
Which is an unthinkable, blasphemous conclusion. God is the freest being in the universe. Why? Precisely because he always acts in perfect accordance with his holy desires. Nothing constrains him. Nothing restrains him.
He does exactly what he pleases, and what he pleases is always infinitely good.
This proves conclusively that absolute certainty of outcome, the guarantee that God will always do right, is perfectly consistent with the highest, most glorious form of liberty.
It proves that true moral agency does not require a blank slate. Moral agency requires understanding, a capacity of choice, and the ability to act on that choice. Edwards briefly contrasts this with non-moral agents to highlight the point. He looks at the sun and the fire.
Right. The sun does a tremendous amount of good. It warms the earth, it causes crops to grow, it sustains physical life. But we do not praise the sun for its moral virtue. It is not a moral agent.
It is just doing what it was made to do naturally.
Similarly, a fire that breaks out in a city and burns down buildings does an incredible amount of physical evil. But we do not put the fire on trial for murder. We do not blame the fire as a sinful, responsible agent.
Why is that? Because the sun and the fire lack understanding. They do not act from choice guided by reason or moral inducements. They operate by sheer natural force.
True moral agency requires a mind that perceives good and evil, feels the weight of motives, and makes choices based on those perceptions.
Even though our choices are mathematically tied to our strongest motives, we are moral agents because we are making real, calculated preferences based on what our minds perceive.
So, synthesizing these massive philosophical concepts, we see a framework that completely alters how we view ourselves. The will is not an independent monarch ruling over the soul, making arbitrary decisions.
The will is simply the mind choosing.
Those choices are always, without exception, driven by our strongest motives, whatever our mind views as the greatest apparent good in that exact isolated moment.
And because our choices follow our motives, there is a philosophical certainty to our actions. But this certainty does not destroy our liberty. True liberty is simply acting on those motives without external constraint.
We are entirely free to do what we want. The tragedy of the human condition is that, due to the fall, what we naturally want is rebellion.
That is the moral inability we discussed. We are bound by our own corrupt desires.
We are physically capable of obedience, but morally bankrupt. This means our hearts need a divine overhaul, not just better options placed in front of us. If you put a plate of mud and a plate of premium steak in front of a pig, the pig will choose the mud every single time.
The pig is free to choose the steak. There is no physical barrier. But its nature dictates that the mud is the greatest apparent good.
To get the pig to choose the steak, you do not just need to explain the nutritional value of the steak. You have to change the fundamental nature of the animal.
Which is why this entire philosophical framework magnifies the grace of God so brilliantly. Since we are morally unable to choose him, since our strongest motives are perpetually bent away from him, salvation cannot be a matter of God just offering a choice and waiting for us to generate the right response from a neutral will.
We have no neutral will.
Salvation must be entirely a sovereign act of God, changing our core disposition.
The Holy Spirit has to operate on the mind. He must shine a light into the darkness so that Christ, who previously appeared foolish or undesirable to the natural mind, suddenly becomes our greatest apparent good.
Grace is God restructuring the motives of the heart.
When a person is saved, they do not come to Christ against their will. They come because God has so beautified Christ in their perception that their will eagerly, desperately chooses him. The scale is tipped by sovereign, divine intervention.
It is the ultimate display of divine sovereignty working in perfect harmony with human responsibility. We are held accountable because we choose what we desire. We are saved because God mercifully gives us new desires.
So what does this all mean for you today? This has been a rigorous theological study, and it demands serious reflection. We want to leave you with a final, lingering question to ponder on your own as you go about your week.
It is something we all need to ask ourselves.
If your daily choices are mathematically dictated by whatever your heart currently views as the greatest agreeable good, what are you actively doing today to shape what your heart finds agreeable tomorrow? What inputs, what habits, what contemplations are you feeding your mind to ensure that holiness becomes your strongest motive? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We will see you next time.